In December of 2010, a police officer and his cadaver dog were walking a stretch of overgrown brush along Ocean Parkway on Long Island, New York. They were searching for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old escort from Jersey City, who had vanished 7 months earlier after running from a client's house in the beachside community of Oak Beach, screaming that someone was trying to kill her. She was never found that day. Instead, the officer found a body. Then another. Then another, then another. 4 sets of remains wrapped in camouflage-patterned burlap bound with belts and tape, dumped within a quarter mile of one another along that same lonely stretch of parkway, as if left there by someone who knew the terrain better than anyone alive. They came to be known as the Gilgo Four. Investigators would eventually recover 10 sets of human remains scattered across that same corridor of Suffolk County scrubland. And for 13 years, nobody knew who had put any of them there. This is the story of the Gilgo Beach killings and of Rex Heuermann, the man who spent nearly 2 decades hiding in plain sight because he looked nothing like what people picture when they imagine a serial killer. Rex Heuermann was an architect. He lived in Massapequa Park in a 2-story house on a quiet street in Nassau County, married to his wife Asa for over 2 decades, father of a daughter and a son. He commuted daily into Manhattan, where he ran a small architectural consulting firm out of an office near Penn Station, a business he had built over more than 30 years, working on projects for local businesses and government agencies. Colleagues described him as quiet, meticulous, a large man, 6'4", with an unassuming presence that made him easy to overlook. Neighbors said he mowed his lawn, waved from his porch, seemed like nothing more than an ordinary, if slightly odd, fixture of the block. Some, more bluntly, remembered him as the neighborhood oddity. A man who had lived on the same street for more than 2 decades without ever exchanging more than a few words with people living a few doors down. Rex Andrew Heuermann was born in 1963 and raised in that same house in Massapequa Park, the son of Theodore Heuermann, a World War II veteran and former aerospace engineer who had worked on satellites, and Dolores, a homemaker neighbors would later describe as a controlling presence in her son's life. Family members recalled a tense childhood, a boy often fearful of his father's temper and demanding expectations. His father died in 1975 when Rex was only 12. He graduated from Berner High School in Massapequa Park in the early 1980s, remembered by classmates as reserved and largely kept to himself, and went on to study architecture, eventually founding his own consulting firm, RH Consultants and Associates, in Manhattan in 1994, the same year he purchased his childhood home outright from his own mother. He would go on to marry Asa Ellerup, a woman he had first met as a teenager in 1996, and the two would raise a blended family together, her son from a previous relationship, and their own daughter, who would later go to work at her father's firm. By the time of his arrest, neighbors had watched the house itself grow visibly run down compared to the tidier homes around it. Even as Heuermann's firm reportedly built him a comfortable 6-figure income working with corporate and government clients across the city. That ordinary exterior, according to investigators, concealed a second life that stretched back to at least 1993, one built around burner phones, fictitious online aliases, cash payments, and a willingness to drive for hours to find women he believed no one would miss. That year, 2 hunters walking through a wooded area of North Sea near the Hamptons found the body of 28-year-old Sandra Castilla, a woman originally from Trinidad and Tobago who had been living in New York. At the time, nobody connected her death to anything larger. For years, her killing was even attributed to a different man entirely, a Long Island contractor named John Bittrolf, who had been separately convicted of killing 2 other women in the 1990s and was long suspected by some investigators of being tied to the broader Gilgo pattern. It would take advanced DNA analysis decades later to clear Bittrolf of Castilla's murder and instead connect a strand of hair on her body to Rex Heuermann. 10 years after Castilla, in July of 2003, the skeletal remains of 20-year-old Jessica Taylor were discovered by a dog walker in a wooded stretch of Manorville. Her head and forearms had been severed and were never recovered with the rest of her, a mutilation prosecutors would later argue was a deliberate attempt to prevent identification. It worked for a while. She would not be formally identified for years, and additional remains connected to her would not surface until March of 2011, found nearly 8 years later and several miles away during the search that would eventually uncover the Gilgo Four. Once again, no one linked the case to anything beyond itself. Between 2007 and 2010, 4 more women disappeared, all of them advertising escort services online, all of them vanishing after arranging to meet a client. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25, living in Norwich, Connecticut, when she took an Amtrak train into Manhattan and never returned. Her disappearance wasn't reported to police for more than a week. Melissa Barthélemy was 24, and in the days after she went missing in July of 2009, her teenage sister Amanda began receiving a string of taunting phone calls from a man who seemed to know details only her sister's killer could know, mocking the family's grief, refusing to say where she was. Those calls, made from burner phones, would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case more than a decade later. Megan Waterman was 22 and disappeared from a motel in Hauppauge in June of 2010. Amber Lynn Costello was 27, last seen leaving her home in Babylon in September of 2010 to meet a client. A friend who witnessed her leave that night would later describe an unusual boxy pickup truck idling outside, a detail that meant nothing to investigators for over a decade, until it meant everything. It was the search for Shannan Gilbert, the 5th missing woman, that led police directly into that thicket along Ocean Parkway in December of 2010 and directly onto the remains of the other 4. The discovery triggered a wider search of the surrounding area, which over the following months turned up still more remains, some belonging to the 4 women already identified, others belonging to victims who would not be named for years, including a set later confirmed as Jessica Taylor's, and another eventually linked to a woman named Valerie Mack, 24, whose partial remains had actually first been discovered in Manorville back in the year 2000, a full decade before Gilgo Beach entered the public consciousness at all. Shannan Gilbert herself would not be found until nearly a year later, in December of 2011, her remains discovered in a marshy area not far from where she had last been seen. Investigators ultimately concluded that her death was likely accidental, the result of a drug-induced drowning after she fled into the marsh in a panic, and not connected to the pattern of the other killings, a conclusion her family never accepted and continued to dispute for years afterward, including in the period after Heuermann's arrest. Shannan's mother, Mary Gilbert, became the case's most relentless public advocate in the years that followed, publicly accusing Suffolk County Police of botching the investigation from the very beginning and of treating her daughter and the other victims as disposable because of how they earned a living. Her campaigning helped keep the case in the news through years when police had little to show for their efforts, years complicated further by a corruption scandal that consumed Suffolk County law enforcement itself, including the eventual criminal conviction of the county's former police chief. A scandal that critics argued diverted attention and resources away from the Gilgo investigation at a critical time. Mari Gilbert did not live to see any of it resolved. She was killed in 2016, years before Heuermann's arrest, by one of her other daughters during a mental health crisis, an unrelated tragedy that nonetheless meant one of the case's fiercest voices was gone long before justice arrived for anyone. Not every set of remains found along that corridor was ever connected to Heuermann at all. Investigators eventually recovered 10 sets of human remains across the wider search area, and 2 of them belonged to a woman and a small child, found years apart but genetically linked to one another, nicknamed by investigators simply Peaches, for a tattoo on her torso, and Baby Doe. It took investigative genetic genealogy decades later for authorities to identify them as Tanya Denise Jackson, a 26-year-old Army veteran from Alabama, and her 2-year-old daughter, Tatiana Marie Dykes. Heuermann has never been charged in either of their deaths, and police have repeatedly cautioned that although the timing and location of their remains have long tied them to the broader Gilgo pattern in the public imagination, their case may ultimately be unrelated and remains to this day unsolved. What followed was, to put it plainly, one of the most publicly criticized law enforcement failures in recent American history. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach case became shorthand for institutional indifference. As more remains kept surfacing along that same corridor of coastline and woodland, the unspoken implication hung over the entire investigation. These were sex workers, women whose disappearances had gone unreported for days or weeks, women whose deaths, in the eyes of a slow and understaffed investigation, apparently did not carry the same urgency as other homicides. The case metastasized into public spectacle. Journalist Robert Kolker spent years investigating the victims' lives for his 2013 nonfiction book, Lost Girls, an unsolved American mystery, widely credited with reframing the story away from tabloid fascination with a nameless killer and toward the women themselves, who they were before they became case files. The book was adapted in 2020 into a Netflix film of the same name, directed by documentarian Liz Garbus and starring Amy Ryan as Mari Gilbert, dramatizing her fight to force police into taking her daughter's case seriously. It became the subject of a string of further documentaries and podcasts in the years after, all built around the same haunting, unanswered question, all released into a void where no answer existed yet. And through all of it, the killer, whoever he was, kept living his second life undisturbed, close enough to the crime scenes that investigators would later determine he could see the search efforts unfold from familiar roads he drove every week. The break came not from a tip or a confession, but from an act of political will. In January of 2022, Ray Tierney, newly elected as Suffolk County District Attorney, after campaigning in part on the failures of the Gilgo investigation, assembled a new task force, pulling together detectives from Suffolk County Police, the New York State Police, and federal agencies, including the FBI, under the name the Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Task Force. Their mandate was to start over, a comprehensive review of every piece of evidence collected since 1993, every discarded lead, every witness statement that had been filed away and forgotten. Two details buried in that mountain of old paperwork became the thread that unraveled everything. The first was the witness account from the night Amber Costello disappeared, describing an unusual first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck parked near her home, a distinctive model that had been discontinued years earlier and was uncommon enough on Long Island to be traceable. The second was a belt recovered near one of the crime scenes, marked with the initials WH or HM, handled by whoever had left the remains there. Cross-referencing registration records for that specific truck model against the surrounding area, investigators arrived at a name in March of 2022, Rex A. Heuermann, whose consulting business was registered nearby and who had at one point owned exactly that model of Chevrolet Avalanche. From that point forward, the investigation became an exercise in extraordinary patience. Detectives did not yet have anything close to enough evidence to arrest a prominent, married Manhattan architect on suspicion of being a serial killer who had eluded capture for nearly 30 years, so they began building the case in silence. They surveilled Heuermann for over a year, tracking his movements, his phone records, his patterns. They discovered that between March of 2022 and June of 2023, someone using his internet connection had been searching obsessively for information about the Gilgo Beach Task Force's progress, about serial killer psychology, about how DNA evidence was used to catch people like him. Investigators nicknamed him in their own internal shorthand, the Ogre, a reference to his physical size and the coldness of what they believed he had done. To get a usable DNA sample without alerting him, investigators turned to a legally established but ethically uncomfortable tactic, surveilling his garbage. In January of 2023, a surveillance team watched Heuermann discard a piece of pizza crust into a public trash can in Manhattan near his office. They recovered it. The DNA extracted from that crust was compared against genetic material recovered from the crime scenes decades earlier, and it matched. Investigators quietly kept building, later recovering 11 more discarded items, bottles thrown out from a trash can outside his own home in Massapequa Park, each one adding another layer of genetic corroboration. By July of 2023, prosecutors believed they had enough. On July 13th, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Midtown Manhattan office and taken into custody. He was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder in the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. At his arraignment 2 days later, in a Riverhead courtroom packed with reporters, he pleaded not guilty, reportedly breaking down in tears as he did, and was ordered held without bail. Prosecutors told the court they were confident a fourth charge for the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes was coming soon. Back in Massapequa Park, his wife and children were, by his wife's own account in a later interview, left reeling, living under a barrage of media attention, the two children crying themselves to sleep as the story broke around them and as the family home became a crime scene in front of the entire country. 12 days later, on July 25th, investigators concluded an exhaustive search of Heuermann's family home. What they found reportedly included a basement stocked with dozens of firearms, along with a hidden compartment and an external hard drive containing more than 300 gigabytes of data, which prosecutors said included extensive violent pornography and, more chillingly, an obsessive personal archive of news coverage and law enforcement updates about the very murders he was suspected of committing. District Attorney Ray Tierney told reporters at the time that the investigation had already involved more than 300 subpoenas and search warrants, and that it was far from finished. "This case is not over," he said. "It's only beginning." He was right. Over the following 11 months, the case widened dramatically. In January of 2024, Heuermann was indicted for the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, after investigators matched a strand of hair recovered near her body to a genetic profile built not from Heuermann himself, but from his own wife, whose DNA shared enough familial markers to close the loop. In April of 2024, the task force conducted a sweeping, week-long search of wooded areas stretching from Manorville to North Sea using cadaver dogs across dozens of acres, some of it near the same property once linked to John Bittrolf, the man wrongly suspected for years of killing Sandra Costilla. Then, in June of 2024, 2 more indictments arrived at once. Heuermann was charged with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla, closing the loop on the 2 oldest cases in the entire pattern, the 2003 Manorville killing and the 1993 North Sea killing, each tied to him through advanced forensic genealogy performed on old hair samples. Shortly after, he was charged with the second-degree murder of Valerie Mack as well. In total, 7 women killed across a span of 17 years from 1993 to 2010. Prosecutors said the method in nearly every case was the same: strangulation. During that same stretch of years, investigators also finally identified a woman whose partial remains had been cataloged only as Jane Doe 7 for more than a quarter of a century after they were first discovered along the Long Island shoreline in 1996. Using advanced DNA analysis, she was identified as Karen Vergata, 34 years old, last seen alive in Manhattan working as an escort. At the time of her identification, police declined to publicly connect her case to Heuermann, even as prosecutors were separately petitioning the court for a fresh DNA swab directly from him. One more thread quietly being pulled toward a conclusion that would not become public for years. Throughout all of it, Heuermann maintained his innocence. He pleaded not guilty at every arraignment. His defense team spent much of 2024 and 2025 filing motions to suppress key pieces of evidence, particularly the DNA gathered from his discarded trash, arguing that the collection tactics amounted to an unconstitutional search, and pushing separately to have some of the 7 indictments split apart into individual trials rather than combined into one, betting that a jury forced to weigh each killing in isolation. Without the cumulative weight of 7 cases stacked side by side might be less certain of a conviction, prosecutors fought to keep everything together, arguing that the pattern itself, the same method, the same category of victim, the same disposal sites, was part of the evidence. The court ultimately sided with the prosecution, ruling the case would proceed as a single consolidated trial. A trial date was eventually set for September of 2026, expected to become one of the most closely watched serial killer trials in American history. It never got there. In late March of 2026, sources close to the case began telling reporters that Heuermann was preparing to change his plea. On April 8, 2026, standing before Suffolk County Supreme Court Justice Timothy P. Mazzei, Rex Heuermann pleaded guilty. Not to some of the charges, not through a negotiated reduction, but to all 7 murders he had been indicted for. 3 counts of murder in the first degree for Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, and 4 counts of murder in the second degree for Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costilla, and Valerie Mack. And then he went further than anyone in the courtroom expected. As part of his required allocution, the formal, on-the-record admission a defendant must give to justify a guilty plea, Heuermann told the court that he had also killed an 8th woman, 34-year-old Karen Vergata, a case he had never been formally charged with at all. He described in his own words, over nearly 2 hours, how he approached and lured each of his victims, how he strangled them, and how, in more than one instance, he dismembered their bodies afterwards specifically to delay or prevent identification. In exchange for that complete, voluntary confession covering all 8 killings, prosecutors agreed he would never face formal prosecution for Vergata's murder, and Heuermann agreed to waive his right to ever appeal any part of the plea. It was, by design, final. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no possibility of acquittal on a technicality. Just a confession spoken aloud into the court record by the man who had spent 17 years killing and 17 more years afterward walking free. Sentencing came a little over 2 months later on June 17, 2026, in the same Suffolk County courtroom in Riverhead. The room was packed with the families of his victims, many of whom had waited more than a decade, some more than 3 decades, for a moment like this. Heuermann sat through nearly 2 hours of testimony in a rumpled gray suit, a blue shirt, and a gold tie, largely impassive, occasionally glancing down, as one relative after another stood to address him directly. Violet Swasher, Jessica Taylor's cousin, who happened to turn 43 years old that very day, told him she could not put into words the hatred she felt. Liliana Waterman, Megan Waterman's daughter, said the proceedings would never erase what had happened, but that they finally brought a measure of accountability after a lifetime of not knowing. Missy Kahn, Maureen Brainerd Barnes' sister, said her sister had never been forgotten, that the guilty plea brought some solace, and that she would never have stopped searching for justice. Brainerd Barnes had left behind 2 children who were only 7 and 1 years old when their mother disappeared in 2007. Nearly 2 decades later, in that same courtroom, they stood as adults to describe how her absence had shaped every part of growing up, and how they had never gotten the chance to let her see who they became. Ed and Joanne Mack, Valerie's parents, spoke about the future their daughter never got to have, the dreams she never got the chance to chase. Amanda Funderburg, Melissa Barthelemy's sister, who as a teenager had once picked up the phone and heard her sister's killer mocking her grief, was finally, after 17 years, able to speak directly to the man on the other end of those calls. District Attorney Ray Tierney addressed the court as well, telling the judge that 8 young women had been brutally and needlessly murdered by the defendant's hands, and that nothing Heuermann could say or do in that courtroom could mitigate what he had taken from those women and from their families. He asked for the maximum sentence the law allowed. When it was his turn to speak, Heuermann gave only a brief statement, offering little in the way of remorse. Judge Mazzei, before handing down the sentence, called him a coward directly in open court. Families in the gallery stood and applauded. The sentence itself was structured to leave no ambiguity, no possibility, however remote, that Rex Heuermann would ever again draw breath as a free man. 3 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. On top of that, a consecutive sentence of 100 years to life, covering the murders of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costilla, and Valerie Mack. Stacked together, the math is almost beside the point. Rex Heuermann, 62 years old at sentencing, will die in prison. As part of the plea agreement, he also agreed to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, sitting for interviews intended to help investigators understand patterns that might be used to identify other unidentified killers, an unusual concession that gave prosecutors something beyond punishment, the possibility that his case might, indirectly, help close others. During the nearly 3 years he spent in custody awaiting the resolution of his case, Heuermann was held alone in a segregated cell at the Suffolk County Jail in Riverhead, largely isolated from the general population for his own safety, and, according to the county sheriff, spent much of that time reading crime novels, occasionally receiving visits from his lawyers or from members of his family. At one point, according to the sheriff, he briefly exchanged correspondence with another notorious incarcerated killer, known publicly as the Happy Face Killer, a detail that surfaced only after his sentencing. One more strange footnote in a case that had already produced more than its share. What makes the Gilgo Beach case linger long after the sentence has been handed down isn't just the number of victims or the length of time it took to catch him, though both are staggering on their own. It's the shape of the man underneath it, not a drifter, not someone living on the margins, easy to suspect, easy to isolate, an architect, a father, a husband of more than 2 decades, a man who drove into Manhattan 5 days a week, sat through client meetings, went home at night to the same street, the same family, the same quiet, unremarkable house, carrying inside him a second life that 8 women paid for with everything they had. For 17 years he killed, and for 17 more he simply continued living, undisturbed, close enough to the search parties combing the woods for his victims that he could have driven past them on his way home from work. The case did not end with a manhunt, or a standoff, or anything resembling the version of these stories usually put on screen. It ended with a task force willing to start completely over from nothing in 2022, with a truck description that had sat unexamined in a file for over a decade, with a belt bearing 2 initials nobody had matched to anything, and, in the end, with a piece of discarded pizza crust in a Manhattan trash can. 8 women killed across 17 years were reduced for far too long to a grim statistic, a stretch of coastline that became synonymous with a killer nobody could name. In the years since Heuermann's arrest, the case has continued to generate its own steady stream of documentaries and specials, each one arriving with new interviews, new footage, new attempts to make sense of how a man could live so completely undetected for so long. A 3-part documentary examining his double life aired the same year his guilty plea became public. A network news special revisited the entire case in the days after his sentencing, walking back through 3 decades of dead ends. Robert Kolker, whose original book had insisted a decade before any arrest that these women deserved to be remembered as more than the circumstances of their deaths, was asked again and again what it felt like to watch the case finally resolve. His answer each time circled back to the same idea, that the story had never really been about the killer at all, no matter how much attention he eventually drew. It had always been about the women whose lives were cut short, and about the families who spent decades refusing to let the world forget them. What finally broke the case open wasn't a single dramatic discovery. It was a newly elected prosecutor willing to reopen a case everyone else had given up on, a task force willing to re-examine 30 years of paperwork line by line, and in the end, investigators who simply refused to let those 8 women stay unnamed, unclaimed, and unanswered for 1 day longer than they already had been. The legal reckoning has not fully ended, even with Heuermann behind bars for life. In the weeks before his guilty plea, Valerie Mack's own son filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him, alleging torture and dismemberment, seeking damages from whatever remains of an estate that had already been gutted by the collapse of his firm, by a divorce that transferred the Massapequa Park house to his now ex-wife as part of the settlement, and by hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid federal and state taxes that surfaced once his finances came under scrutiny. Other families have signaled they intend to pursue civil claims of their own, less in hope of meaningful financial recovery than in pursuit of one more formal public acknowledgement of what was taken from them. Rex Heuermann, for his part, will spend whatever remains of his life exactly where the state intended, alone behind bars, with no firm left to run, no appeal left to file, and no version of his old ordinary life left to return to.